How do you go from hero to zero in a single day? For one American general, it was as simple as running away from a battle and never stopping. Major General Benedict Arnold helped lead the American forces in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775. In 1776, he helped develop one of the first American naval forces, sending a ragtag group of ships against the British on October 1776 on Lake Champlain. And in 1777, he was one of the heroes of the Battle of Saratoga, a defining American victory that changed the course of the war. So far, so good. But things started going sour in the spring of 1779 when Arnold began sending coded messages to British General Henry Clinton, indicating his desire to turn traitor and switch sides. He nearly gave up West Point to the British in September 1780, but Arnold's contact, Major John Andre, was captured and executed by Continental forces. Arnold led a few 1781 campaigns against his former allies and then fled to Britain, where he was widely snubbed for his turncoat ways.
General Benedict Arnold is widely known as the most famous traitor in history.
So what made him do it? Arnold never made his motivations completely clear, but he seemingly felt he wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. He was passed over for promotions, had loyalist in-laws, a wife with expensive tastes, and possible issues with a bad temper and self-esteem. Whatever the reason though, his name is still a synonym for traitor. So as a general tactician, Arnold was great, but as a loyal member of an army, he was absolutely awful. Raised in Britain and sent to fight in North America in the French and Indian War of the 1750s and 1760s, Charles Lee eventually settled in the American colonies and went rebel when the Revolution began. While he won recognition for his command of Charleston, South Carolina during a 1776 attack, Lee was deep down inside a sore loser. He had hoped that he would be picked to lead the Continental Army, but when George Washington won the spot and Lee became second in command, he loudly whined about it. Things got worse when he was captured by the British in December 1776. He was released in 1778, only to embarrass himself at the Battle of Monmouth on June 28th of that year. While leading troops, Major General Lee thought that the British were in the process of surrounding them in order to retreat. Washington was displeased, ultimately rallying the army for a pivotal victory, leaving Lee in disgrace. Lee felt he was ill-treated and let Washington know it in a bitter letter. That move backfired, and Lee was ultimately charged with insubordination and court-martialed. He was suspended for a year, spending that time moaning further about the evil Washington had done to him and getting wounded in a duel by one of Washington's defenders. Lee finally resigned in 1780 and died in Philadelphia 2 years later. Brigadier General Thomas Conway wasn't half bad as an officer, having served in the French military since 1749 and joining the Americans in 1777, but his ego got in the way. Conway felt he wasn't being promoted fast enough. But he didn't exactly win friends with what sounds like an inflated sense of self-worth and frequent criticism of the less formal ways of the Continental Army. Then he fell in with Major General Horatio Gates, who was part of a vocal group advocating for a new commander, a group that became known as the Conway Cabal. When their attempt to oust Washington failed, Conway tried to quit. First time he tried, in October 1777, the Continental Congress refused and gave him a promotion. Conway was still an experienced officer after all. But when Conway did it again in the spring of 1778, they accepted his resignation. In July of that year, a friend of Washington's wounded Conway in a duel, and the man soon left for France. At least he then had the decency to send an apology to Washington. Philippe Hubert, Chevalier de Preudhomme de Borre, he was French if you couldn't tell, was commissioned as an American officer in December 1776. But something awkward must have happened on the voyage to the colonies, as de Borre was apparently made to leave the ship he embarked on and finish the journey on another vessel. Things seemed to go well enough once he landed in New Hampshire and took command of his brigade. But summer brought serious controversy when de Borre hanged a loyalist. George Washington wrote to de Borre on August 3, 1777, that though the executed man had been guilty of a hanging offense, quote, it was a matter that did not come within the jurisdiction of martial law, and therefore the whole proceeding was irregular and illegal, not to mention apt to rile up the colonists. De Borre survived that ordeal, commanding brigades at Staten Island and Brandywine. But his conduct at Brandywine was scattered, with brigades ordered into incorrect positions that may have contributed to the American loss. Washington ordered an inquiry into de Borre's behavior, which prompted de Borre to tender his resignation in mid-September 1777. He tried to backtrack, but it was too late, and Congress decided to pay for him to return to France. At least he didn't have to switch ships on the way back, so there's that. William Howe was a seasoned military man, earning status as a general during the French and Indian War. When he permanently assumed command of the British forces in America in 1776, his army enjoyed several victories thanks to a bold new plan.
British General William Howe brought his army to this area with the intention of conquering New York.
His plan worked, and the British occupied New York City. But in 1777, he made a major mistake. Instead of sending reinforcements to help British General John Burgoyne at Saratoga, he decided to wing it by capturing Philadelphia, a move that very well could be tied to Howe's personal rivalry with Burgoyne. Saratoga was lost thanks to Benedict Arnold. Oh, the irony. Even more ironic is that the Saratoga loss propelled France to enter the conflict on the side of the Americans. As a result, Howe catches some flack from historians for losing the whole war for the British. It wasn't his only mistake, though. Howe missed a chance to capture Washington after the Battle of Trenton in 1776, and he also failed to disband the American Continental Congress after taking Philadelphia. Instead, they simply picked up and moved to nearby Lancaster. In April 1778, his resignation was accepted by Parliament, and Howe returned to England in disgrace. So it's a bit unfair to blame Howe for losing the war just because of Saratoga. It was really all his actions that helped the colonists win. If William Howe proved to be a dud, then surely British forces hoped that his successor would be better. But Henry Clinton, who took over as commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America after Howe's departure, wasn't much better. Things were promising at first, as Clinton successfully took Charleston in 1780, but then he left the South, leaving command of the region to General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis attempted to take more territory in the South despite the increasingly unsteady situation of the British forces, but Clinton didn't make it any easier for him. In May and June of 1780, he issued a series of decrees that alienated the population, leading to a surge in rebel activity. Clinton eventually ordered Cornwallis and his men to station themselves along the Chesapeake Bay and secure a harbor for the British. Cornwallis chose Yorktown, Virginia, where his forces were besieged by the Continental Army and his supporting French forces in October 1781. Cornwallis surrendered on October 19th, effectively ending the war. You may remember this from your history class as Cornwallis being the name associated with Yorktown, but it was Clinton who took the brunt of the criticism for the humiliating loss. The commander-in-chief had failed to send reinforcements in time and more broadly misjudged how to allocate troops and supplies. If he had been more bold, perhaps Cornwallis could have held out. James Wilkinson made such an impression working for Major General Horatio Gates that Gates asked Congress to grant Wilkinson a promotion. Yet the then 20-year-old Wilkinson had hardly any battlefield experience and controversially skipped over more senior colonels to get his 1777 boost to brigadier general. It didn't do the rank much honor either. After the promotion, Wilkinson soon became associated with the anti-Washington Conway cabal. Though it's unclear if he was ever an active plotter, Wilkinson did tell Congress about the affair, implicating Gates and angering his former mentor. This nominally put him on Washington's side, but contributed to his historical reputation as an untrustworthy snitch. Perhaps feeling the heat, Wilkinson resigned in 1778. He returned for a 1779 appointment as the Army's clothier general, but Wilkinson was so lackluster in the role that Washington complained to Congress. They cut his pay, and Wilkinson resigned yet again in March 1781. So he failed at being a general, and he failed at getting clothes for soldiers. Not a great run there. Things did get better for Wilkinson, and by better we mean more interesting for this video. Turns out his brother-in-law was Aaron Burr. You know, the guy from the musical? He was involved with Burr in the conspiracy to literally create a new country out of the Louisiana Purchase. Despite all that, in a court-martial, Wilkinson was made a major general for the War of 1812. But wait, there's more. Following his death, it was discovered he was secretly spying for the Spanish, ruining his reputation permanently. Around 100 years later, Theodore Roosevelt said this of Wilkinson: "In all our history, there is no more of a despicable character." Matthias Alexis Roche de Fermoy arrived in the colonies in 1776 from the West Indies, claiming to be a French colonel, a move that earned him a commission as a brigadier general. But his actions weren't exactly becoming of a great officer. When the British began to move their forces from Trenton to Princeton in January 1777, de Fermoy fumbled. In his defense, he was drunk, but then again, the reason he fumbled was because he was drunk. Luckily, Washington saved the day. In March, de Fermoy was put in charge of Fort Independence, though George Washington reportedly balked at the idea. De Fermoy abandoned the fort on July 6, 1777, and disobeying orders set fire to it. That made it painfully obvious to the British that the rebels there and at nearby Fort Ticonderoga, under the command of General Arthur Sinclair, were retreating. By drawing British attention, de Fermoy put everyone in danger. Despite this, de Fermoy thought he could still rise in rank and asked Congress to make him a major general. After all, he wasn't drunk when he set fire to the camp, so there's that. In a rather sober move, Congress declined this request and de Fermoy resigned in January 1778, with Congress giving him an $800 payout to return to the Caribbean. Horatio Gates was a supremely seasoned British officer. By 1769, however, he had given up his post in the British Army and settled in Virginia with the help of his friend George Washington. Eventually, he joined up with the revolutionary cause. Gates' biggest triumph may have been the victory at Saratoga, where British Major General John Burgoyne surrendered to him on October 17, 1777. Yet this also seems to have marked a downturn in the relationship between Gates and Washington, starting when Gates went straight to Congress with the news of his victory, without first notifying Washington. Things got worse when the Conway cabal tried to remove Washington and replace him with Gates. But his biggest blunder came in the field. Commanding forces in the southern colonies, Gates attempted to face off against British soldiers in Camden, South Carolina on August 16, 1780. The resulting battle was a disaster for the colonists. Even worse, Gates hustled off the battlefield, seemingly abandoning his troops in the middle of their retreat. He was effectively fired in October 1780, and despite a brief reinstatement from 1782 to 1783, his reputation never recovered.
He rides 200 miles all the way back to Hillsborough without stopping and becomes the butt of every mean-spirited joke in the Continental Army.
The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania was notoriously awful. Continental Army forces encamped there faced serious issues, including little food and poor clothing. At least George Washington stayed with the army and focused on training them. If only his quartermaster general was on the same level. That man was Merchant Thomas Mifflin, who joined the Continental Army in 1775 and was soon appointed the force's quartermaster general, as well as becoming a major general. Yet Mifflin reportedly was more interested in making a name for himself on the battlefield than managing unglamorous supply lines. He was also seemingly overwhelmed by the demands of a growing army after Congress ordered its expansion in 1777. There were also allegations that Mifflin was skimming off the top, holding back vital supplies and selling them for his own benefit, or at least of bungling their delivery while the soldiers at Valley Forge suffered. Mifflin also associated with the anti-Washington Conway cabal. With all the surrounding controversy, he stepped away from the post.
Relief is slow in coming. Washington will need help to turn his army back into a fighting force.
Nathaniel Greene replaced Mifflin as the Army's more efficient quartermaster general, a real sting as Mifflin was allegedly jealous of Greene's closeness to Washington. Mifflin came back to serve on the Army's Board of War, but continued disputes with Washington, and Congress led to Mifflin resigning his commission in February 1779. Yet, perhaps thanks to powerful friends, he became president of the Continental Congress in 1783, in time to accept Washington's resignation as commander-in-chief. In terms of everyone we mentioned, Mifflin was probably the most successful outside of his military time, but he was still an awful general.